Hello, everyone, and welcome to Renewed Minds. So, today we're going to be continuing in the series that I started talking about Genesis 1 and some of the symbolic uh, patterns that are established in Genesis 1. So, today we're looking at the creation of light and some of the meanings that holds in different stories. And in this passage, there's we begin another pattern that actually is kind of like a meta pattern that shows up in the first 3 days of the creation account, and that is that not only is there the establishment of a space, so you have the establishment of light and dark, the sky and the sea, and then the land and the sea. So there's the establishing of these spaces, but and that's explicit. There's also implicitly in these creations the establishment of a cycle. Now, the cycle with day and night is actually explicitly described. It's the day, right? There's the evening and the morning. He calls the light day, and the darkness he calls night. So that cycle is explicitly described in this example. But in the other 2 days, there are patterns, there are cycles that come with those spaces that are more implicit. And it's these cycles that represent then time. So there's the division that represents the establishing of different spaces, and there's the cycles that represent the cycle of time. So we're going to look at both of those things here in relation to light and dark. And so let's go ahead and get into it. So Genesis 1 verses 3 through 5 says, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and he separated the light from the dark. And the light he called the day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. So the first thing we see here is the establishing of these spaces. That God, he creates light. He says, "Let there be light," and there's light, and then he separates out the light from the darkness. So symbolically, light has a lot of different meanings. It's kind of one of those like root ideas, root pictures that has a lot of power and a lot of flexibility. It means a lot of different things. And most of what light means, most of the way that light is used symbolically in stories and in the scriptures is going to be familiar to us. We use these kinds of images and metaphors all the time. I mean, think about a light bulb moment. That's a common metaphor that we use light for all the time, and it's the same picture, except they didn't have light bulbs in the Bible. It's just that light of revelation. And so light can represent, so light and darkness are these not contradictions, are contrary ideas, obviously. So light represents clarity and darkness confusion. Light represents truth and darkness represents mystery. Light represents the answer, darkness is the question. Light is identity and darkness is multiplicity, right? So, light is order, darkness is chaos. Light is that space in which work can be done. Darkness is the time of rest. And finally, light is direction. Think like a lighthouse, or the Bible talks about setting a light in the window, and that's it's the light that shines on the path and guides you in your way as you're going home. And then darkness is wandering. Darkness is being lost. When you're in the dark, you have no direction. You have nothing that distinguishes one direction from another. And so that's kind of the contrast that's being set up. That's the word I was looking for. Contrast that's being set up between light and dark, between those two spaces. And as we go through, as these spaces are established, you'll notice first of all that there's uh, that these spaces are nested within each other. So the light, where does the light come from? God separates when he says, "Let there be light." There's light, and He has to separate it from the darkness. If you think about verse 2, where's the darkness? Well, the darkness is in the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness lay over the face of the waters. And so uh, this all this creating that God is doing, these spaces that God is establishing are on the earth. So there's the heavens and the earth, and God above that, and then there's the light that's being produced, and then there's the dark, and then out of the dark waters, God's going to create the sky, the waters above and the waters below, and then from the waters below, there's that gets separated out, and there's the earth and the sea. And so all of these are nested within each other, these spaces that God is creating, and it's like there's a refining going on. God is creating a more and more stable space. And this first space that God's creating is a little bit less stable, right? You can think about light and dark; they're kind of a little bit relative, because you can be standing in darkness or in light, and you look into a room, and that room is dark. But if you go in that room, there's still light shining into that room. And if you take the time to sit, and you don't seize, and you don't act precipitously, your eyes gather the light from the room, and you're able to see. And so there's a relative nature to light versus darkness. They're still obviously different. They're obviously contrasted, but if you're careful enough, you can see in a place that initially looks dark. It just requires patience. And so there's that line there is a little bit blurred. Okay. And we'll see as these spaces, as God keeps establishing order in the earth, those lines become less and less blurred. Those spaces become more and more distinct. So the other thing that I want to point out here is how these symbols show up elsewhere in Scripture, and we want to be careful here, because the temptation is to see light. You'll notice that I didn't call light good and dark evil, because when God creates the world, the darkness is still there. Because darkness, it represents also rest. It represents question. It represents mystery. And within the earth, within the sort of changeability of the earth, there's a necessity for darkness. Because if everything is light, you'll notice God doesn't create the light and then separate the light out and use it to expunge the darkness. He leaves the darkness there because there's still more to do. And when he finishes his work in creation, he leaves more for us to do as well. And he uses that mystery. He uses the challenge of the dark in order to help us to grow, to help us to train us and to discipline us, and to teach us to be more than we are, as we step out into that darkness and trust in his guidance, trust in the light of his will. And so we want to be careful about just calling the light good and the dark evil. And the other reason we want to be careful about this is that there's true light, and there's false lights, right? So if you look at John 1 verse 9, Jesus is described as the true light that gives light to all men coming into the world. And we see plenty of examples in the Bible of people grasping hold of a false light. And what that results in is a self-deception and a tyranny, and a refusal to accept uh, truths that are sort of outside of this system of knowledge that these people have built for themselves. So to give an example of that, again in the book of John, if you look at chapter 8, and starting in verse 12 and going all the way through chapter 9, we see Christ says, it says, then he spoke to them again and said, I am the light of the world. The one following me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And then the response of the people is kind of funny, because they're like, well, you're bearing witness of yourself. Your testimony is not valid. Your testimony is not true. And then Christ argues with them, and they're so locked into these legalistic technicalities of the way that witness can be accepted, that they can't hear the truth of what Christ is saying. And then this, so Christ has this argument with them about true witness and about judging and true judgment, and like what he's come in the world to do and who he is, and how God is bearing witness of the truth of his ministry and all of this, and they just can't see it. They can't see it because they're so locked in the false light that they're grasping onto. And then this is extended to absurd ends when we get to chapter 9, and Christ comes across a man blind from birth, and again we see this same language. The disciples ask, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? And Jesus answers, neither this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God should be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So you see that language again, Christ saying that he's the light of the world. He's the true light. And then he performs a miracle. He gives sight. He brings light to this man's world of darkness. And then there's this whole thing that comes out of that, where the Pharisees, they're so locked into their kind of doctrinal position, their legalistic understanding of things, because Christ gives this man sight on the Sabbath, and they say, well, he worked on the Sabbath. He did a work on the Sabbath, and so he can't be from God. He's got to be a sinner because he did a work on the Sabbath. And it's like, is a miracle really a work? Like really, is a miracle really work? It's God that's doing the work. It's not us. And yet, but they're so locked into this legalistic mindset that they can't see a miracle standing right in front of them. And it actually says, when the man says what happened to him, and they ask him, well, what do you say about this man? So they're arguing, right? The Pharisees are arguing. Some of them are saying, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. And others are saying, how can a sinful man produce such signs? And then so there's this division that rises among them, and they ask the blind man. It's so funny. It actually says, so they ask the blind man. And it's like the irony is just written so thick in this passage. So they ask the blind man, what do you say about him? For he opened your eyes. And he says, he's a prophet. And then it says, so the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received sight, because he claimed something that didn't fall in their doctrinal system. They couldn't even accept that a miracle had been performed. They couldn't accept this thing that was this man, the evidence that was literally standing right in front of them. And this is what it means to grasp onto a false light. And when we do this, when we grab hold of a false light, we actually wind up refusing to even hear anything that might break into our reality and kind of challenge our beliefs. It actually says, because they call us parents, and as parents, like, kind of refuse, they kind of talk around things. They say, when they're asked what happened to him, they say, well, ask him, he's of age. And it actually says his parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews, because the Jews had made an agreement that if anyone should confess Jesus as Christ, they would be cast out of the synagogue. They would be exiled. And so his parents were afraid. They were afraid that they would be painted as followers of Christ. And so they wouldn't actually speak the truth because they were too afraid of what these people that had grabbed hold, that were grasping so hard onto their lies, were going to do to them. And this is what happens when we grab hold of a false light. We lose the ability to hear or to see truth. We lose the ability to see true light, and there's no more light can get into our eyes. And at the end of the passage, Christ calls them blind, and it's true. They are blind. They're more blind than the blind man was before Christ opened his eyes. And so watch out for that in your lives. We need to be careful of this. We need to be careful that we don't fall into this same trap. That we hold our understanding of things in loose hands. There are things that are definitely true. There are we know that God is the true light, that Jesus is the true light, and that He's given us the scriptures. But we need to be careful not to confuse our understanding with the truth of scriptures or with the truth of Christ. We need to have the humility to recognize that we might misunderstand things, and especially when it comes to our view of the world around us. We need to have the humility to recognize that our view of the world around us might be tainted by our biases. It might be that we have grabbed hold of a false light, and so we're refusing to let the truth shine into our lives in one area or another. And we need to ask God to break in. Christ says, I forget, I mean, it's in several of the Gospels, but Christ says, before you remove the speck in your neighbor's eye, take the log out of your own eye, right? And it's so true. Like, we all have logs in our eyes. And if we're going to see clearly to do anything in the world, we've got to take those logs out of our eyes first. And the beautiful thing about it is that the more that we do that, the more that we remove those logs from our eyes, the more clearly we can see in order to identify other areas in our lives where we're not seeing clearly. And this is kind of it's this never-ending process, this never-ending cycle of sanctification, that as we remove more and more of the lies that we've convinced ourselves of, as we give up more and more of these false lights that we're clinging to, we can see more and more of the true light.